lovely people, welcome back to another Story Study Saturday. I'm Sammy and I'm a writer who likes to learn about writing through reading and share what I learn with you. This week I am talking about The Goodbye Love Generation by Kori Frazier Morgan, which is an indie published book by one of my YouTube community member, people who comment on most of my videos, friend, who put me in contact with this author and got them to reach out to me and get this copy of their book in my hands last year before I went on to my leave of absence. The first time that this book was recommended to me, it was on my They Both Die at the End video, which you can check out here if you would like to look at it, because I had talked about how interesting it was that we had chapters from the two main characters' perspectives and then chapters from people who encountered them. And it was like a story told partially through the people who were in the story and partially through people that the story encountered. And I thought that was super interesting. And this is a novel told in short stories, which I don't know if you can see it on this version. So this book got to me quite literally a year ago. It was sent to me in February of 2023. It is now February of 2024 as I am recording and as this video will go up. So I am sincerely, most genuinely sorry about the delay, but I am glad that I had the opportunity to read this book. So assuming you don't know about The Goodbye Love Generation, I will read you a quick summary. A novel told in short stories tied to a band that was on the come up in 1969 and how the Kent State shootings affected the trajectory of their lives and the people they encountered over the span of 50 years. So let's get into my thoughts. I didn't expect to like this book as much as I did, putting that out there. Prior to October of 2023, I never really paid much attention to the political happenings of the real world. I didn't want to. And honestly, I still don't want to, but I more so want the things that are going on to not be happening over my own personal peace. So it took me a little while to pick up this book and drive myself into reading it just because it is kind of a political story. But since October, I have been more open to learning about propaganda and the history of all of the things that the United States have done and like how it affects the rest of the world. So for me, the time that I actually picked up this book was timely. I believe I was like halfway through when Henry Kissinger died, which he's directly related to the war in Vietnam, which led up to the protests that happened at Kent State, which is directly related to this story. And it felt so like connected to the world because of what was going on in the present and what was going on in the story. It feels very present and very timely because there are a lot of protests going on right now for very similar reasons, and it's honestly both upsetting and empowering in a way to notice that we are still going to continue fighting for the right thing. And it's upsetting because we have to keep fighting for the same right thing. Either way, this book, I didn't know that I wanted to pick it up until I picked it up, and it gave me a sense of comfort that I did not expect with what's going on in the present day. Back into the actual meat of the story, the writing of the story, rather than the context of the story. I did really enjoy the fact that the story structure is told in short stories, not like chapters as you would normally expect from a book, but it is kind of a format that has to grow on you. Like you have to know that that's how it's working, because the way that like if I wanted to continue reading a book with chapters, I could stop on a chapter break and know that I would want to dive back in. But for this book, when I had to stop, I would have to stop in the middle of one of the short stories so I would be able to like dive back in and feel like I am aware of where I was rather than stopping at the end of a story. It was like a little bit harder to pick back up, but once you get used to the flow and the structure of it, it's great. I also love a book that has multiple perspectives in like the chapter form. I love switching between different characters and getting multiple perspectives and multiple viewpoints and multiple different conflicts and emotional engagements. I love multiple perspectives, and this structure is basically the same thing. It's just spread across more planes of story than just perspective 1 and perspective 2. Plus, I love the characters, how almost every single person that shows up in one of these short stories as a perspective character is a domino effect to the progress of the story, and each person has something to grow from. They all have their own battles, and they all, like, some of those battles are faced on their own and some of them are faced together. It's interesting to piece together what one character was going through from another character's story perspective, where like you have enough of a reference point from their perspective to say this is how that timeline affects this character's perspective in this time, and seeing how they all play in together. It's super interesting, and it really keeps you engaged with what the characters are actually up to and like how their emotional state changes, and you don't have to stay in the same character's perspective for all of those things. I wasn't super drawn to the concept of it being like a school shooting. I didn't have the historical frame of reference for it. I just knew it was a shooting at a school, and there's been so many school shootings since this one happened in 1970 that I was like, okay, it doesn't super matter to me before I started reading it. It's one of the things that like pulled me out of diving into it, was like, I don't know how to care about this particular school shooting. And it made it a lot easier to feel comfortable having engaged with the story, because there's a short story set in 2019 that follows a teenage girl who is thinking about, why is this school shooting important? There's been so many, and having that point of view touched on and engaged with really makes it feel like my questions were answered before I had the chance to have the critique of it. By having that perspective addressed in the story, it makes the rest of it feel like it clicks into place, because it clicked into place for that character. I think it's important to write the story that's calling out to you, because if you have something speaking to you and you try to avoid it, it may limit the amount of creative space you have towards working towards something different, because that story is calling out to you. That story is something that it desperately wants you to tell. And the author of this novel wrote it because she felt drawn to the place where she's from and telling the story of the place where she's from, which is Northern Ohio, where Kent is. There's a heart in this story that can't be replicated on purpose without having that draw and the story speaking through you. I think it's really empowering, because Kori said that she wanted to write about where she's from. So what do I think could be improved? I think a lot of the setting relies on sort of an inherent knowledge or experience of Ohio, the Midwest in general, and like that kind of space. And I have enough of a reference point for like Iowa and Illinois that it felt Midwestern, but it wasn't like I knew for sure what exactly was going on in the story setting wise, because it relies on that sort of, it's kind of a basic location, but I wish that there was a little bit more setting to grasp onto, and it wasn't like super important or distinctly something that pulled me out of it. It was something that I thought about afterwards as being like, I don't really know where that was spatially. I'm not entirely sure how close that bar is to the campus. Where is that? Because my frame of reference is the University of Iowa. I don't know what Kent State looks like. I don't know what the town around the university is like. I have never been there. I don't know the distance to things. I don't know where the events of the story took place. I just sort of have this sort of generic Midwestern state school area vibe. There are a couple of formatting things and grammar things in this that like just sort of come with the territory of being an indie published book, and they didn't bother me. I mean, there were a couple of things that pulled me out of the story just because of the formatting that made it feel a little bit more like work. But once you got further in, and once I realized that if I stop in the middle of a chapter, it's easier, or in the middle of a story, it's easier for me to keep going the next time that I pick it up. There's less of that like momentum stealing. But the pages in my copy, I don't know if this is how it is for all of them, are not aligned on the outside edge. They are only aligned on the inside edge, which is like such a small detail. You don't really think about it in books that are aligned like with the block text, but when it's not there, you're like, oh wow, hello. It took me genuinely a very long time to actually start the story, because the very first page is on the left side instead of the right side when you open it, and that threw me way off. But it's not like anything crazy, and then there are a couple of typos, which very low stakes, very, very low stakes. But it's really just the shape of the text block that pulled me out, and how the first page was that slowed me down from getting started. But once you get like a third of the way through that first story, it's so much less noticeable. It's like very, very low on the scale of things that need to be done better. It's very low stakes. I also wasn't entirely clear on why the story was split into parts or sides, because it's supposed to be, I think, sides of a record. It doesn't necessarily align with a different time because there are different times represented in both of the sides. I wasn't sure why it was split where it was split, other than for the imagery of having the like two sides of a record, which is also fine. When I see that, I feel like I'm digging for more additional meaning behind it. So I don't know if I just missed the more additional meaning behind it or it didn't have the more additional meaning behind it. But if it didn't have the more additional meaning behind it, I would have liked something else to go off of. If instead of just having the title of the short story as your chapter heading, if you're going for the record thing, I don't know if records would have been called tracks, but on CDs it was called tracks. So maybe something like that, something to really draw on the imagery of having that record player aspect to it, but it doesn't, I don't know, it's just like a little bit of sprinkled in there on that. Even like song 7, side 2, song 7, whatever. Because I think all of the chapter headings could definitely be song titles if you structured them that way. I wouldn't have any questions. I do have one question for the story, which is what happened to Alex's brother? I feel like so many of the loose ends, well, I'm never gonna know how that ends up. I got to know how they ended up, except for what happens to Alex's brother. He just never comes back. I wanted him to come back. I don't know. Hello? What happened to Alex's brother? So what can writers learn from the Goodbye Love generation? Write the story that speaks to you. No story hasn't been told. Every possible structure of a story has been told, but no story has been told the way that you would tell it, because you're the only one who could do that. Even if it's something that's common trope or a retelling of something or a fictionalized account of a historical event, there is no one else who can do it the way that you would do it. So just go ahead and try. There's no reason to not. Playing with format is cool. If you have a short story or a couple of short stories, you could see if they can interact well, if you can link them together with another short story. You can take a short story that is complete and build out some additional conflicts into it and expand it and see what happens there. There is no limit to what you can do with something that you've already created. You can always continue to expand it. You can expand it to make the story longer, or you can expand it to link it with other things going on at the same time. Exploring with that kind of thing, seeing where your characters in a short story who ended up happily ever after are 10 years later might lead you to something that you never would have discovered about those characters and give you something to work with and expand on or explore and just get better at the practice of writing. Don't let the drive to do something or the parameters set by outside expectations limit you to one thing. You can do whatever you want. It's your writing, it's your words. You can publish it yourself. You don't need to have anyone else's approval other than yours, and you don't need to publish it if you don't want to. It's always worth exploring your own creativity in any way or form. I think that this book was a super interesting example of what you can do, because all of these short stories, well, I think all of them, most of the short stories, if not all of them, were published individually into magazines and literary publishings on their own, and then put them together into this context. It creates a totally new story. So just explore. I think that that's something that is super learnable from this book. But that is all that I've got for you today. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It'll really help me out. You can find links to find Kori in the description box below, as well as get a copy of this book if you would like. I am here every week on either a Tuesday for a writing topic video or Saturday for a story study video just like this. So I will see you guys next week.